Don't be like Jonah. I imagine that for most of us who've either read the book of Jonah before, or as we've been working through this series, that is probably one of the first and primary takeaways from this story. Don't be like Jonah. If God is calling you to something, don't be like Jonah and run away. When God is clearly trying to get your attention, don't be like Jonah, hiding from God. When the Lord calls you to speak truth, don't be like Jonah, remaining silent. When the consequence of your sin is staring you down, don't be like Jonah, turning inward on yourself. And the book of Jonah is short, and yet it's a powerful story that highlights what not to do. But if we're honest with ourselves, we know that often we are just like Jonah. I do kind of wonder if maybe one of the reasons we have spent so much time focused on just a couple of verses in the story about the great fish, the incredible story of a man being swallowed by a whale and living to tell about it, is because if enough emphasis, if enough attention is on that, I can ignore my reflection in the mirror of Jonah. I can push aside the exposure of my own heart, which tries to run and hide from God's call and work in my life. I can ignore the times when I give it into temptation, when I'm not allowed the truth of God's word to take root in my heart. Discipline is uncomfortable, and I would much rather seek that which gives me pleasure. While the primary implication of Jonah is to not be like Jonah, I don't think there's any denying that we are quite often just like Jonah. And this morning, we are going to once again come to Jonah chapter 2. And we spent some time looking at this chapter last week, considering how it fits within the narrative, within the story of Jonah. Last week, we asked the questions: why does the great fish matter? Is it true? What is the gospel connection that Jesus makes in Matthew's gospel? We focus primarily on the story element of these verses. But today, as we come back to Jonah 2 and we hear these words, we're going to look at the poetry of Jonah 2. I mean, that's what the majority of this chapter is. It is biblical poetry. And we're going to see these words from the perspective of Jonah's experience, expressed through his emotional response to what is going on, his response to his own sin, his response to who God is, and his response to what God does. And while these descriptions that he gives, they may or may not be actual experiences, this is what Jonah feels like is happening. And through these powerful and descriptive words, we are encouraged to examine our own experiences. Our experiences with sin. Our experience with who God is and what he has done. As we said last Sunday evening in our Bible study, poetic passages like this address or inform our minds through our hearts. And that is what we intend to do as we explore this passage. We want to listen to the song of Jonah, which describes who God is when we are like Jonah. When we as God's people sin and disobey and act in a rebellious way towards our Lord, who is God? And what does he do? I'm going to begin reading verse 1 of Jonah 2 this morning. Jonah's been in the belly of the fish for 3 days. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head. At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with a voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Before we begin to answer the question, who is God when I am like Jonah? We do need to make note of an application from the very beginning of this text. Be like Jonah. Be like Jonah. Right from the gate, as we turn the page from Jonah 1 to Jonah 2, the application of the text moves from don't be like Jonah to be like Jonah. Now, if you're familiar with the story of Jonah, it's not going to be like that for much longer. We'll get back to the application of don't be like Jonah as we turn to chapter 3. But here in chapter 2, it's be like Jonah. It's a great example to us. When we are in distress, when we have sinned against God, when we see ourselves in Jonah, pray to the Lord, just like Jonah does. This is what this poetic passage is. It's a prayerful song to the Lord, calling out to him. And we would do well as God's people to be a praying people, even in our sin. And again, the reason for this, as we will see, it is because of who God is when we are like Jonah. To sort of organize our survey of this text, our study this morning, we're going to lean into two main things. The first thing we're going to look at, and going to spend the majority of our time, is the destructive nature of our sin. The destructive nature of our sin. We want to listen to how Jonah captures the experience of living in opposition to the Lord and his ways. And we'll see here, as we look at this text, that this isn't unique to him, but this is the common experience of all of God's people. This is something that we must take serious. Sin is destructive. So that's the first thing we're going to consider. Secondly, we want to take notice of God's heart towards sinners. God's heart towards sinners. This is something we've already traced throughout this series. But as we look at these verses here, as we explore Jonah's experience, we're going to note some short yet simple, significant statements. Statements that not only communicate truth to us, but draw us, even in our sin, to seek the Lord in his goodness. Who is God when we are like Jonah? Well, that brings us to our first question this morning, our first thing to consider, the destructive nature of sin. Last week, we commented on how Jonah is a part of the prophetic section of the Old Testament. The books that we find right at the end of the Old Testament, kind of beginning with the book of Isaiah and leading us to the end of the Old Testament to Malachi. Now, if you've ever read the prophets before, most likely you have found this to be a bit of a difficult read. That they're at points very challenging to understand. And this is a common experience for most Christians when reading the prophets. I mean, there's certainly some wonderful sections that we're drawn to at Christmas and Easter, like Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, the anticipation of the Messiah and his work. But the reality is many sections of the prophets leave us with more questions than answers. Tim Mackey is one of the founders of the Bible Project. And in some teaching that he has done on this portion of the Bible, the prophets, he gives a very helpful overview, sort of a basic description of how the prophets fit into the Bible. And he really begins by placing them in the context of the story of the Bible. So he doesn't isolate them from the story of the Bible. Rather, he places them into the midst of the Bible. And we can define the prophets as men of God who speak to the people of God with a message from God. If we think about the collection of the prophets, it's a collection of writings where men of God speak to the people of God with a message from God. And that is most certainly true. That is a helpful definition. But if we neglect to see the story of which the prophets are fitting into, we can listen to their words, we can hear their words, we can read their words, but we can walk away sort of not really understanding their words. And so Mackey brings us from the very beginning to the story of the people of God, in particular to the people of Israel. And he takes us to the major event or the major season in their history. The story of the Exodus. Now, we're going to get there in either next week or the following in Jesus Storybook Bible. But here we read in the book of Exodus that the people are enslaved in Egypt. And God not only rescues them out of that slavery, but God makes a covenant with them. He is their God, and they are his people. And if you read through the book of Exodus, there are some beautiful passages that shine a spotlight on that reality. But if you keep reading beyond Exodus, and sometimes even within the book of Exodus, Israel will quite often turn from the Lord. They will sin against God. They will break their covenant promise to him. They disobey his good law. They worship the gods of other nations. They doubt God's promises. And then they are led into exile. Their sinful hearts draw them away from the deep, meaningful fellowship with their God. And this is where the prophets come in. These men of God speaking to the people of God a message from God. A message which calls out their sin. It accuses them of their disobedience. You have broken your covenant promise to the Lord. And then they come with a message of warning. This is what will happen if you continue in your ways. Throughout the prophets is this message, calling out sin and warning, exile, distance from God. So much of the prophets is that simple message, the sin of the people exposed and the warning of consequences. Does that remind us of anyone? Does that remind us of Jonah? For all of the prophets, their message takes the form of a poetic sermon. The communication of words of accusation and words of warning. But Jonah is the only prophet whose message is in the form of a story, of a narrative. And I think the intensity of this is felt at its highest, at its peak here in Jonah 2 with this prayer. I mean, we've mentioned Jonah's sins the last couple of weeks. We spent 3 weeks looking at Jonah 1, and we can just go through the list of sins, of rebellion, of running away from God. But here in chapter 2, with language that he uses in this prayer, we get a real sense of the depth of his exile. The exile that is brought about by his sin and rebellion. Take a look at some of the descriptions of this. In verse 2, Jonah says, "Out of my distress." Jonah's sin has taken him to a place of trouble. Now, this has been the case from the very beginning. I mean, you kind of get that as Jonah is supposed to go to Nineveh, but he runs to Joppa and to Tarshish. But as we followed this distress, this trouble, it's kind of been building up over time. In previous settings, he's been able to sort of ignore the distress, the trouble that he's in. He runs from it, he hides from it, he tries to sleep it off. But we get here to chapter 2, and where is Jonah? Not only is he in the sea, but he's inside the fish. There is no ignoring his trouble. It has completely overtaken his experience. As he continues, the description of the depth of his exile takes on new impacts. Verse 2 again, "Out of the belly of Sheol." Sheol is a Hebrew word, a word found all throughout the Old Testament. And depending on its context, it can be translated a number of different ways. It could speak kind of generally to the grave, to a pit, more specifically to hell. In the general sense, it refers to the place of the dead, a place where one is cut off from the living with no access to the matters of earth. Oftentimes throughout scriptures, it is understood to be a place where there's no praise of God. It's a place of judgment. There's no return. It's a place of exile. And this is what Jonah says he has come face to face with. His sinful heart has brought him into great trouble. A literal place where he is cut off from the living. Distress and Sheol, trouble and death. But then notice the language that brings to mind the idea of how crushing sin is. Verse 3, he is in the deep. He's in the heart of the seas. If you've ever watched one of those documentaries on the depths of the ocean, one of the things that is so fascinating, it's hard to comprehend is the amount of pressure in that place. You know, just a small square inch takes the weight of like 3 buses or something. It's unbelievable the amount of pressure. And Jonah's facing that. Literally. The flood is surrounding him, he says. A little later in verse 5, the waters closed in, the deep surrounded. Verse 6, I went down, the bars closed upon me. Jonah is quite literally in a tight prison as the skeletal structure in the inside of the great fish is closing in on him. It's the expression of how crushing sin is. Not only is he crushed, but he is facing suffocation. We often see pictures of Jonah in the belly, and again, we've kind of been picking on children's books and Bibles, but they often put this in picture in sort of a comedic way. It's this cramped space that's sort of visually like a one-room flat in London. I mean, I've even seen depictions of Jonah in the belly of the fish with a campfire. I mean, I'm not sure how that comes about, but that's something that has been shown. But look at what he says here in verse 5. Jonah says, the weeds wrapped around my head. Verse 7, my life was fainting away. There's nothing funny in this. There's nothing comedic about this. Jonah expresses the trouble he is in, the distress that he is in. and extreme graphic detail. He speaks of facing the certainty and immediacy of death as he is literally strangled. This is where his disobedience, this is where his rebellion, this is where his sin has brought him. And this is the prophetic warning in the story of Jonah. But this is not something that is unique to Jonah. This is the experience of all of God's people. Even in the book, or in the Old Testament, Israel expresses very similar language to this. Hosea is another one of the prophets of the Old Testament. In fact, he's one of the earliest prophets. And in some of his writings, we glimpse this same visual. This destructive nature of sin, which is crushing and suffocating and leading to exile. Look at the words of Hosea 8, 1-4. He says, "Set the trumpet to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. To me they cry, 'My God, we, Israel, know you.' Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold, they made idols for their own destruction." Just like Jonah, Israel's sin is on display. They've rebelled against God's law. They've neglected what is good and right. They did not submit to God's authority. They worship falsely. Again, it sounds a whole lot like Jonah. But then listen to what Hosea writes in verses 8-10. He says, Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel. For they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up, and the king and princes shall soon rise because of the tributes. There in verses 8 and 9, they are swallowed up. They are wandering alone. Just like Jonah, they are crushed and they are in exile. Another prophet, Jeremiah, he writes out of a very similar context. Jeremiah 1 verse 51-34. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has devoured me. He has crushed me. He has made me an empty vessel. He has swallowed me like a monster. He has filled his stomach with my delicacies. He has rinsed me out. Sounds a whole lot like Jonah. The Bible is clear. The prophets are clear. The Lord is clear. Sin is destructive. And Christian, I know that as we sit here this morning, that when we hear this, we know this to be true. Right? We believe this to be true, but we look at Jonah's life, his sin, his distress, and we see ourselves. We don't always live in light of this. I mentioned this passage a couple of weeks ago, but we're a lot like Jonah, we're a lot like Paul. Right? What does Paul say? The things I don't want to do are the things I do. And the things I want to do are the things that I don't do. And we feel the weight of that. We feel the weight of our sin. We feel the weight of our heart, which at times is curved inward on itself and brings about a sense of exile. Not broken relationship with God. That is secure. That is kept safe. But an exile where we sense this broken fellowship. In our struggle with sin, we feel like Jonah does in verse 4. Driven away. Maybe like was mentioned in Hosea. Wandering. Often in our sin, the last person that we want to hear from, the last person that we want to be near to is the Lord himself. And this can feel crushing and suffocating. We can look at our sin and we can feel the tentacles of sin grasping us tightly, pressing in on us. Well, think about the words that Jonah says here about the bars, right? It's like this prison, and the New Testament speaks of sin as slavery, something that is binding and holding us captive. While we know all this, we have those times in our lives when we run from God. We run from his ways rather than running to him. We keep silent rather than speaking the truth to ourselves. We ignore his discipline rather than allow it to bring correction. We doubt his character and his attributes and his promises, and we focus on what I think is best. And before you know it, just like Israel, just like Jonah, we feel as though we are wandering. We're swallowed up. We're driven away. Life is fainting from us. Sin leads to exile. Now is not the time, though, that we're going to bring our sermon to a close. And that is really good news, is it not? Because there is still more in Jonah 2 to discover. Because we need to consider God's heart towards sinners here. And I want to go back to that teaching by Tim Mackey on the prophets. Because we gave sort of two parts to their story. Two parts of what they are communicating to God's people. They call out sin and they warn of exile. But thirdly, they proclaim a message of rescue and restoration. The prophets are full of expressions of how our sin is great. But God's promise is greater. They talk in powerful language of how sin is strong. But God's work in the heart of his people is mightier. They express sin's destruction and how devastating it is. But also how God's redemption brings complete healing. And we see that here in Jonah. Because we see God's heart towards sinners. If you look at Jonah chapter 2 and you were to circle all of the portions that talk about sin's destructive nature, percentage-wise, that content fills up the majority of Jonah 2. But what is it that makes this such a glorious poetic prayer? It's these little bursts running all throughout these verses. They're short yet profound bursts of reminders of who God is. Right now in our family, one of our favorite songs is titled The Voyage of St. Brendan. And most of the song is a simple repeating of a phrase. We'll be all right if the Lord be on our side. We'll be all right if the Lord be on our side. We'll be all right if the Lord be on our side. And then it concludes, and the Lord, he's on our side. And that is a simple echo of what we see here in Jonah 2. As we do bring our time to a close, I just want to consider three ways that we see God's heart towards sinners. And to be honest with you, these aren't going to be a surprise to you. We've already mentioned all of these in our series thus far, but Jonah himself, in this poetic prayer to the Lord, this song to the Lord, draws these out here. First, the Lord disciplines his own. The Lord disciplines his own. Verse 3, for you cast me into the deep. Your waves and billows passed over me. Jonah's not shy about speaking truth here. Quite different from the experience on the ship, just moments or maybe days prior to that, where he kept silent. Here, he's very bold about the truth. While his sin has brought him to this place of distress, he knows that the Lord has been at work providentially drawing Jonah to himself. And notice how Jonah prays here. Jonah in this prayer never prays for salvation from the fish. Rather, it's like this prayer of thanksgiving for the fish. That which should have been his final death blow is that which protects him and saves him. Now, this mode of discipline is not easy. It's not nice. It's not fun. Just imagine yourself inside the belly of a fish. But Jonah's learning. His heart is seeking the Lord, when just moments earlier he was running from God. I know we've mentioned it before, but as we look at Jonah's prayer here, Christian, know that the Lord's discipline in your life is a sign of his great love for you. He does not let sin continue in our lives. Like the prophets, he calls it out. Like the prophets, he gives a warning. In fact, I think Jonah is one of those warnings to us, that he doesn't let sin go away. And when we continue to sin, when we continue to rebel, when we continue to run from God, he seeks after us and he deals with our sin. And in a way, again, which we need to hear over and over again, is drawing us to himself, to his love, to his fatherly care for us. His discipline in our lives is for our good. That brings us to the second thing we see about God. He's always with his people. He never abandons his own. Again, we've touched on this in previous sermons. We can't ignore the repetition in this story, in this song. Jonah says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and what? He answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol. And remember what we said earlier. Sheol is this place of the dead. It's this place of no return. It's this place of exile. And Jonah says, out of the belly of Sheol, out of the belly of that place, I cried, and the Lord heard my voice. Verse 7, my prayer came to you. Christian, I know that when there is sin that we are wrestling with, whatever it is in our lives, we can feel like Jonah in verse 4. We can feel driven away. The last thing we want to do is hear from God. The last thing we want to do is speak to God. The last thing we want to do is open up his word. But Jonah here is reminding us that what we need the most is the Lord. And like Jonah in verse 7, we need to remember him. We need to remember who he is. He is the one, end of verse 7, who is in his holy temple. He's God Almighty. He's the holy and the righteous one. When we remember him and we have the destruction of sin and its nature before us, we'll respond like Jonah. We'll call out to the Lord. We'll pray to him. We'll confess our sin. We'll thank him for who he is and what he has done. And just like for Jonah, our God is ready to hear. Our God is ready to work. And that leads us to the last thing this morning. God is the God of salvation. Verse 9. Don't you just love how this song comes to a conclusion? Salvation belongs to the Lord. Jonah is hopeless and helpless, and yet there is life. As he says in verse 6, he is brought up from the pit by God. Verse 4, I shall again look upon your holy temple. The Lord saves. This too is something that Israel had experienced in their life and something that they sang about. In Psalm 124, it's a song that the people of Israel would have sung every time they made their way up to the temple. Just as Jonah again would do. And listen to what the people of God sing. Psalm 124, verses 2 to 8. If it had not been the Lord who was on our side when people rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us up alive when their anger was kindled against us. Then the flood would have swept us away. The torrent would have gone over us. Then over us would have gone the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord who has not given us as prey to their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. The Lord, by way of his grace and mercy, brings an end to the crushing exile. That is the experience of God's people. That is the experience of coming under God's heart towards sinners. As we end our time today, we're going to sing a song. And this is a new song for us. A song with some powerful words, particularly in the first verse and chorus, as we consider the story and the prayer of Jonah. The title of this song is Christ is Mine Forevermore. And all that we've looked at in Jonah chapter 2, the words we've just read in Psalm 124, the message of the prophets which conclude with the good news of restoration and redemption, all of it is looking forward to Jesus Christ. Looking forward to our Lord and Savior, to the one to whom salvation belongs. It's looking forward to the one who has defeated sin and death, to the one who has set captives free from sin. And again, Christian, we know all of that. We believe that. We confess that. And yet that we know there are times in our lives when we wrestle with sin, when we can feel driven away at a distance with a sense of exile. But a song like Jonah 2, a song like we're going to sing in just a moment, is a reminder of who God is when we are like Jonah. It speaks of his glorious salvation, his good continuing work in us, and that we shall again look upon his holy temple. As we mentioned on Wednesday evening, we await for what is recorded in the book of Revelation when the redeemed people of God are forever gathered around the throne. So as the song is played, feel free to join in and sing. Listen, look at the words, use them as a prayer of your own heart. Allow them to warm your affections to the Lord, to draw you to remembering who he is, to remind you of the great and glorious gospel, to convict you of sin, and to give you hope as you look to Christ and hold on to his promises.